Off the rugged Pacific coast, the notorious black tide pirates believe they've found an easy target in Port Haven's quiet fishing community. As they begin their brutal raid, they see only weather-worn boats and terrified villagers scrambling for safety. What they don't see is Sarah Chen watching silently from her modest fishing shack. Before she learned to cast nets and read tides, she was the FBI's deadliest SWAT sharpshooter, with a perfect record in crisis intervention. As the pirates spread terror through the harbor, they're about to discover they haven't invaded a helpless village. They've walked into a kill zone crafted by a master tactician who never lost her edge. In the next 12 hours, these predators of the sea will learn what it means to become prey themselves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen's calloused hands moved with practiced precision as she coiled the fishing net, each loop falling perfectly into place. Dawn had barely broken over Port Haven, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. The familiar weight of her grandfather's knife pressed against her hip, the only weapon she allowed herself to carry openly these days. 5 years of casting nets had failed to dull the situational awareness drilled into her by 2 decades of SWAT operations. Even now, as she prepared her small boat for the morning catch, her mind automatically catalogued every detail. 3 fishing vessels already out in the deeper waters, old Mr. Rodriguez doing his morning check of the pier supports, young Mai skipping rocks by the breakwater instead of helping her parents with their morning preparations. The methodical work of readying her boat brought the same focused calm she once felt while maintaining her rifle. Everything had its place, every action its purpose. The fishing lines were checked with the same attention to detail she once gave her tactical gear. Her daily equipment inspection was as thorough as any pre-mission checklist. A flash of movement caught her eye. Mai had stopped throwing rocks. The girl stood frozen, staring out at something beyond the harbor's natural breakwater. Sarah's hand instinctively twitched toward the hidden compartment beneath her boat's gunwale, where her old service weapon lay wrapped in oiled cloth, untouched for half a decade. Through the morning mist, 3 shadows moved against the horizon. Their silhouettes were wrong for the local fishing fleet, too large, too swift, cutting through the water with predatory purpose. Sarah's fingers traced the familiar grip of her grandfather's knife as she watched Mai sprint toward her parents' shop, the girl's instincts telling her what Sarah already knew. Those weren't fishing boats. The peaceful rhythm of Port Haven's. Morning continued around her. Fishermen calling out greetings, the smell of fresh bread from Mrs. Lee's bakery, seagulls squabbling over scraps near the cleaning stations. But beneath it all, Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her chest, the same tension that had preceded every major operation in her previous life. She made a show of continuing her preparations, movements deliberately casual as she studied the approaching vessels through her peripheral vision. Their heading and speed suggested they weren't simply passing by. They were coming to Port Haven, and something in their approach set off every warning bell in her tactical mind. As if sensing her thoughts, the old scar tissue in her left shoulder began to ache. A souvenir from her last active mission, the one that had convinced her to seek a quieter life. But as she watched those ships draw closer, Sarah knew with cold certainty that the peace she'd found in this small fishing village was about to be shattered. She had chosen Port Haven because it was off the grid, too small to attract attention. But someone had found it anyway, and as Sarah finished her preparations with the same precision that had once made her the FBI's most reliable crisis responder, she realized she might soon have to make a choice between maintaining her cover and protecting the community that had become her home. Harbor Master Chen Wei, no relation to Sarah, though he'd taken to treating her like a daughter, limped along the weather-beaten dock, his cane tapping out a familiar rhythm against the wooden planks. Sarah watched him pause to exchange. He words with each boat owner, his weathered face creasing with laughter despite the early hour. He reached her last, as he did every morning. "The sea is restless today," he said in Mandarin, their private morning ritual. His eyes, sharp despite his 70 years, flicked toward the horizon where the mysterious ships had grown larger. "Yes," Sarah replied in the same language, continuing her preparations, like the waters off Taipei before a typhoon. She'd never been to Taipei, but the old man didn't know that, just as he didn't know that when she mentally catalogued his approach, speed, gait pattern, and likely medical response time, it wasn't out of concern for his health alone. "Mai saw something that scared her," he said, switching to English. "The child has good instincts." Sarah nodded, testing the tension in a rope. "She's observant, like her grandfather was, I heard." The harbour master's expression softened at the mention of his old friend Mai's grandfather, lost to a storm 2 years ago. He would have noticed them too. Back in the war, he could spot a hostile vessel before anyone else. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the cry of seagulls and the gentle lapping of waves against the hulls. Sarah used the moment to check her phone. No signal as usual. Port Haven's isolation was part of its charm, but it also meant they were on their own if trouble came. "You know," Chenwei said carefully, "in the storage room behind my office, there's an old radio, maritime frequencies. Been meaning to test it." Sarah met his eyes. In 5 years, this was the closest they'd come to acknowledging that he knew more about her past than he let on. "Might be a good day for that." He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "The room's lock is broken. Code to the office is 4739 if you need anything." With that, he shuffled away, leaving Sarah to process this offering of trust. The morning progressed with an artificial normalcy. Sarah completed her boat preparations, but didn't launch. Instead, she made her way to the small shop that served as Port Haven's general store, run by Mai's parents, the Nguyens. "No fish today, Sarah?" Mrs. Nguyen asked, as Sarah selected a few basic supplies, batteries, rope, the first aid supplies. She'd been meaning to restock. "Weather feels wrong," Sarah replied, adding a handful of energy bars to her purchase. Mrs. Nguyen nodded understanding. Fishermen's superstitions were respected here. Throughout her shopping, Sarah noted the subtle signs of unease spreading through the village. Boats returning early, children being called inside, shutters being checked and secured. Port Haven's residents had survived countless storms. They knew when danger approached. In her storage shed behind carefully arranged fishing gear, Sarah accessed a hidden compartment she'd installed her first week here. The waterproof case contained her insurance policy, a disassembled Remington 700 rifle, her old service pistol, and enough ammunition to start a small war. She'd told herself it was just habit, the same way some people kept earthquake kits they never expected to use. As she worked, Sarah's mind drifted to her last active mission, the hostage situation that went wrong, the decisions that haunted her, the scars that had driven her to seek refuge in this quiet village. She'd sworn never to pick up a rifle again, but as she watched 3 unidentified vessels bearing down on her adopted home, she realized some promises were made to be broken. The harbour master's radio crackled with the first distress calls from nearby fishing communities. Reports of attacks, coordinates of vessels spotted, desperate warnings cut short. Sarah logged each detail, her mind automatically constructing tactical maps and response scenarios. The harbinger of violence was approaching. Port Haven, and she was the only one who knew just how bad things might get. Sarah counted 3 main vessels through her compact binoculars. Fishing boats converted for speed and stealth, their registration numbers crudely painted over. The black tide pirates' reputation had reached even Port Haven's isolated shores. Ruthless efficiency, military-grade weapons, no survivors left to testify. Their pattern was becoming clear. They were systematically targeting remote fishing villages along the coast, each raid more brutal than the last. Standing in the harbour, master's office, Sarah studied the maritime maps while keeping one ear on the radio chatter. The pirates' attack formation was professional, cutting off escape routes to the north and south. Not common thugs then. These were trained men, probably ex-military gone rogue. The thought made her jaw clench. She'd seen too many good soldiers turn mercenary during her SWAT days. "They're saying Westbrook Harbor is gone," Chen Wei said quietly, listening to another frequency. 30 dead, rest missing. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the radio dial. "We should evacuate." Sarah shook her head, muscle memory from 100 operations taking over as she analyzed terrain and sightlines. "No time. They've positioned their fastest boat to cut off the southern channel. The northern route is too shallow for a quick escape." She caught herself using her command voice and softened her tone. "How many people in the village now?" 43. Most boats came in when we started hearing the warnings. The number hit her hard. 43 lives. In her SWAT days, hostage numbers had been statistics, variables in tactical equations. But now she knew every one of these people, had shared meals with them, watched their children grow. Memories of her last mission flashed unbidden. The hostage situation that went wrong. The split-second decision that saved 3 lives but cost her the career she'd built. The counselors had called it PTSD, said she'd lost her edge, recommended a desk job. Instead, she'd chosen nets and boats and peaceful dawns. But peace was a luxury about to be stolen from Port Haven. A commotion outside drew their attention. The village council had gathered, elderly fishermen, shop owners, and community leaders arguing about their options. Sarah watched through the window as Mrs. Nguyen gestured frantically toward the approaching ships, while others shook their heads in denial. "They don't want to believe it's really happening," Chen Wei sighed. "We're not fighters here." Sarah's hand brushed unconsciously against her left shoulder, feeling the rough scar tissue through her shirt. "Sometimes we don't get to choose." She turned to the harbour master. "Decision made. I need you to quietly spread word to families with children. Get them to the old fish processing plant on the cliff. The concrete walls are thick there and it has a clear view of the harbour." Chen Wei studied her face. "You're not just a former police officer, are you?" he asked softly. "No," Sarah admitted. "I'm not." She paused, wondering how much to reveal. "But right now, I might be these people's only chance." The distant sound of diesel engines grew louder. Sarah estimated they had 30 minutes at most. Her mind raced through options, mapping out firing positions, cataloguing potential weapons, identifying choke points where the village's narrow alleys could be turned into kill zones. "I need to get something from my shed," she said. "When I come back, I'll be different. Try to keep people calm and away from the main dock." Chen Wei gripped her arm as she turned to leave. "Whatever you were before, you're one of us now. Don't forget that." Sarah nodded, throat tight. As she stepped into the morning sun, she felt the weight of her choices bearing down. She'd come to Port Haven to escape violence, to find peace. Instead, she'd brought her old world right to its doorstep. The pirates were coming, and with them, the person Sarah had tried so hard to leave behind. Agent Chen was about to resurface, and God help anyone who threatened her new home. The first shot came without warning, a single crack that shattered the morning calm, followed by the splintering of wood as a bullet tore through Mr. Rodriguez's fishing boat. The old man dove for cover, years of maritime instinct saving his life as a second round punched through where he'd been standing moments before. Sarah watched through her scope as the pirate's lead vessel cut through the harbour entrance, a gunman visible on the bow. Her Remington 700 felt familiar in her hands, like greeting an old friend she'd hoped never to see again. From her position in the bell tower of Port Haven's tiny chapel, She had clear sight lines across the entire harbor. Warning shots, she muttered to herself, reading the pirates' tactics. Professional restraint. They wanted to herd the villagers, not slaughter them outright. Yet, the radio at her hip crackled. "They're demanding we gather at the main dock." Chen Wei's voice was steady despite the situation. "Saying they'll sink every boat if we don't comply." Sarah keyed her response, voice clipped. "Keep people back. I count 12 armed men on the lead boat. Second vessel approaching from the south, third holding position outside the harbor." Through her scope, she watched the lead vessel dock with practiced efficiency. The pirates moved with military precision, establishing a perimeter as their apparent leader stepped onto Port Haven's soil. He was tall, carried himself like a commander, his weapon held low but ready. Then everything went wrong. Young Mai broke away from her mother's grasp, running toward her father's boat, where their family cat was still trapped. Mrs. Nguyen screamed. A pirate raised his rifle. Sarah's world narrowed to her breath and heartbeat. Time slowed as training took over. Inhale, calculate distance, wind speed, target movement. Exhale halfway. Squeeze. The crack of her rifle echoed across the harbor. The pirate aiming at Mai crumpled, a precise shot through his shoulder taking him out of the fight without killing him. Her second round found another gunman's leg before they realized they were under fire. "Get down!" the pirate's leader bellowed, his accent marking him as ex-military, possibly Australian. His men scrambled for cover as Sarah's third shot punched through their radio man's equipment, sending sparks flying. Mai reached the safety of her mother's arms as the pirates returned fire, their bullets harmlessly peppering the chapel's stone walls. Sarah was already moving, breaking down her rifle with practiced speed. She'd given away her position, but she'd gained something more valuable. The pirates now knew they weren't dealing with helpless fishermen. Through the chapel's back window, she caught glimpses of villagers fleeing inland. Chen Wei was coordinating the evacuation, just as they'd planned. The pirates' attention was focused on the bell tower, exactly where Sarah wanted it. "Contact Harbor Master," the pirates' leader's voice carried clearly across the water. "Tell them they have 1 hour to surrender the shooter, or we start burning boats with their owners aboard." Sarah's jaw clenched as she slipped through the chapel's hidden basement exit. The tunnel, once used by smugglers, would take her to the old cannery. Her mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles and approaches. She had 58 minutes to change positions, set up her next shot, and most importantly, to ensure the pirates didn't make good on their threat. The familiar ice-cold focus of combat settled over her. In her SWAT days, this clarity had made her legendary, the ability to shut out everything except the mission. But now, with every face in danger, one she knew by name, that detachment was harder to maintain. The pirates had made their first move. Sarah had responded. And in doing so, she'd crossed a line she'd sworn never to cross again. But as she heard the distant sound of more boats entering the harbor, she knew there was no going back. The only way out was through, and the path would be marked in blood. Inside the old cannery, Sarah found Chen Wei with a group of villagers, their faces pale but determined. The harbor master had done well. He'd gathered those with military or police backgrounds, however limited. 3 former Vietnamese army veterans, a retired Coast Guard officer, and surprisingly Mrs. Lee from the bakery, who'd served as a military nurse. "I need you to understand something," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of her SWAT days. "What I'm about to tell you will change how you see me. But right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is surviving the next few hours." She laid out her Remington on a rusty table next to her backup pistol. "I was FBI SWAT, specialized in maritime and coastal operations. Those men out there, they're not just pirates. They're ex-military, probably special forces. They came expecting easy prey. We're going to show them they're wrong." The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Lee. "That's why you always checked the exits when you came for coffee," she said quietly. "Why you asked about the old tunnels under the village." Sarah nodded, spreading out a hand-drawn map of Port Haven. "The tunnels are our advantage. These men don't know about the smuggling routes from the Prohibition era. We're going to use that." The Coast Guard veteran, Jackson, leaned forward. "They've got superior firepower and numbers. What's stopping them from just burning the whole village?" "Pride," Sarah replied, checking her watch. "Their leader, the way he moves, how he commands. He's elite forces. Men like that don't like being made to look foolish. He'll want to catch me, prove his dominance. That gives us time." She assigned roles quickly, drawing on each person's background. The Vietnamese veterans would coordinate civilian evacuation. Through the tunnels, Jackson would organize a distraction at the South Pier. Mrs. Lee would set up a covert medical station in the old fish processing plant. "What about the rest of us?" Chen Wei asked. "Those who've never fought." Sarah handed him a radio. "You're my eyes. The villagers trust you. I need to know where the pirates are moving, what they're doing. Use the children. They know every hiding spot in Port Haven, and the pirates won't expect them." A crash from the harbor punctuated her words. Through the cannery's grimy windows, they watched as the pirates overturned boats, searching for her. Their leader's voice carried across the water. 30 minutes left. Don't make me start the demonstration." "Time to move," Sarah said, checking her weapons. "Remember, you're not trying to be heroes. Your job is to keep our people safe and feed me information. I'll handle the rest." As the group dispersed, Chen Wei caught her arm. "The village council is meeting in the basement of the general store. They're discussing surrender." Sarah's expression hardened. "Delay them. I need 20 minutes to show these bastards what they're really dealing with." She moved through the shadows of Port Haven's narrow alleys, the weight of her rifle balanced against the burden of responsibility. Behind her she could hear Mrs. Lee quietly organizing the villagers, Jackson's voice carrying instructions, the Vietnamese veterans already leading the first group toward the tunnels. The pirates had given her an hour to surrender. She'd use that time to turn their own tactics against them. They thought they were hunting her, but in these narrow streets, with these people at her back, she was the apex predator, and it was time to remind them why she'd earned her reputation in the FBI. The coastal fog rolled in thick and low, a blessing Sarah hadn't dared hope for. Through the mist, the pirates' infrared sensors would be useless, their night vision equipment worse than worthless in the soupy grey murk. This was her element. The same conditions she'd mastered during countless SWAT operations in San Francisco Bay. Two-man team moving past the processing plant, Chen Wei's voice whispered through her earpiece. Armed with AR-15s, they're checking buildings systematically. Sarah moved like a shadow across the slick rooftops of Port Haven's Cannery Row, her boots finding purchase on the weathered shingles. Below, she could hear the pirates' frustrated commands as their organized search pattern began to unravel in the fog. A memory surfaced, her SWAT instructor's voice. "Urban terrain is three-dimensional. Your opponents think in straight lines. Don't." The first pirate never saw her coming. As his partner turned to check an alley, Sarah dropped silently from above, her grandfather's knife finding the pressure point in his shoulder. A precise strike. Painful, disabling, but not lethal. She dragged him into the shadows before his partner could turn back. "Charlie Team, report." The radio on the unconscious pirate crackled. "Charlie Team, what's your status?" Sarah keyed her own radio. "Jackson, now." On cue, the sound of breaking glass and shouts erupted from the South Pier. The pirates' radio came alive with confused chatter as their forces split to respond to the diversion. "They're separating," Chen Wei reported. 4 men heading toward the disturbance. 3 maintaining position at the main dock, 2 searching the market district. Sarah stripped the unconscious pirate of his radio and ammunition. A quick check revealed military-grade equipment. Further confirmation these weren't common thieves. She zip-tied his hands and moved on, the fog swallowing her form. The market district was her next target. The maze of vendor stalls and storage. Sheds provided perfect hunting grounds. She could hear the remaining pirates' movement, their boots heavy on the wooden boardwalk. "Contact Harbor Master!" The pirates' leader's voice boomed through the mist. "Your time is running out, and now you've drawn blood. Surrender the shooter or we start executing villagers." Sarah's hand tightened on her rifle. The threat was real, but she read the underlying tension in his voice. He hadn't expected resistance, hadn't planned for a protracted engagement. Through her scope, she caught glimpses of movement. The two pirates in the market district had regrouped, moving back-to-back in standard close-quarters formation. Professional, careful, but they were looking at ground level, not above. She used the vendor stall's canvas awnings to move silently overhead, positioning herself at the intersection of two alleys. Below, the pirates swept their weapons back and forth, jumping at shadows in the fog. "Movement!" one of them called out, spinning toward a noise in the mist. It was Mai's cat, darting between crates. The momentary distraction was all Sarah needed. 2 precise shots with her suppressed pistol. One through a shoulder, one through a knee. The pirates were down before they could radio for help. 2 more packages secured, she whispered to Chen Wei. "Have the Vietnamese veterans moved them to the holding area?" "Sarah," Chen Wei's voice was urgent. "The council, they voted. They're going to surrender you to save the village." She processed this while zip-tying the downed pirates. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe less. They're drafting a message now. Sarah checked her ammunition. 5 incapacitated pirates. 7 still active, including their leader. The fog wouldn't last forever. "Tell Mrs. Lee to prepare the medical station," she said finally. "Things are about to get louder." The pirates had come expecting to break Port Haven's spirit through fear. Instead, they'd found themselves being hunted one by one, their tactics turned against them. But Sarah knew the real battle was still to come, because somewhere in that fog, their leader was waiting. And something in his voice, in his methods, nagged at her memory. A ghost from her past she couldn't quite place. The pirates adapted faster than Sarah expected. Through the swirling fog, orange flames suddenly lit up the harbor as they set fire to the first fishing boat. The message was clear. For every 10 minutes she remained hidden, another vessel would burn. "They're getting desperate," Jackson's voice crackled through her radio, switching to scorched earth tactics. Sarah watched from her position atop the fish market as thick black smoke began mixing with the fog. The pirates' leader stood on the main dock, his silhouette illuminated by the burning boat. Something about his stance, the way he directed his men, it scratched at the edges of her memory. "Chief Wu's boat is next," he shouted into the harbor mist, "along with his family if our friend doesn't show herself." The radio clicked twice, Chen Wei's signal that the Wu family was safely hidden in the tunnels. But the pirates didn't know that. They were expecting panic, chaos, a village turning against her to save themselves. Instead, they got silence. "Something's wrong," one of the pirates muttered, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Where are the villagers? Why aren't they begging?" Their leader paced the dock, his frustration visible in every movement. "Spread out, check every building, every basement. These people are hiding somewhere," Sarah keyed her radio. "Mrs. Lee, status of the medical station?" "Ready," came the quiet reply. "Everyone's in position." Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. While the pirates had been focused on finding her, the villagers had executed their own operation perfectly. Every non-combatant was now safely hidden in the old tunnel network, ready to move further inland if necessary. The only people left above ground were her makeshift resistance force. "Jackson, on my mark, trigger the charges." They weren't real explosives, just fuel drums and fishing flares rigged to create a convincing distraction. But the pirates didn't. Know that either. 3, 2, 1. The south pier erupted in a cascade of light and sound. The pirates spun toward the explosion, automatically dropping into defensive positions. In that moment of chaos, Sarah made her move. 2 more precise. Shots dropped the pirates nearest to their leader. Non-lethal wounds, but definitely out of the fight. The leader himself dove for cover, but not before Sarah caught a clear glimpse of his face in the firelight. Her blood ran cold. Marcus Kane, she whispered. The name brought back a flood of memories. Her last mission, the hostage crisis that went wrong, the man who'd escaped while his team was captured. You remember me then, Agent Chen? Kane's voice carried across the harbor. I was wondering if you would. Sarah's mind raced. Kane being here wasn't a coincidence. These raids weren't random. They were bait, designed to draw her out of hiding. Chen, "Way," she whispered into her radio. "Get everyone deeper into the tunnels, now!" "Sarah, what's wrong?" "The game just changed. These men aren't here to raid the village. They're here for me." Through the smoke and fog, she could see Kane directing his remaining men into new positions. He knew her tactics, her training. He'd been part of the same Special Forces program that had trained many SWAT operators. 5 years I've been looking for you, Kane called out, after you ruined everything in Singapore. Did you think you could just disappear, become a simple fisherwoman? Sarah's jaw clenched. Singapore. The mission that had earned her a commendation and a bullet wound. The operation that had exposed Kane as a corrupt operative selling tactical information to terrorist cells. You're surrounded, Sarah. Your little resistance movement ends now. Come out, face me, and maybe I let these villagers live. But Sarah noted what Kane couldn't see from his position. The villagers had succeeded in their task. The harbor was empty of civilians. The burning boats were creating a smokescreen better than any military cover. And most importantly, Kane had just revealed his true objective. This was no longer about protecting Port Haven. This was about finishing what started in Singapore. And this time, Sarah didn't have to worry about civilian casualties. She keyed her radio one last time. All units, execute Plan Delta. It's time to show these bastards why you don't threaten a fishing village. The trap was set. Now it was time to spring it. The third pirate vessel that had been holding position outside the harbor finally made its move. Through the smoke and fog, Sarah watched as it cut through the water with military precision, its profile much larger than the other boats. This wasn't another converted fishing vessel. It was a professional smuggling craft, loaded with enough firepower to level Port Haven. I see you've noticed my insurance policy. Kane's voice carried across the burning harbor. Did you really think I'd come after you without backup? That ship's carrying enough explosives to turn this quaint little village into a memory. Sarah's mind raced as she reassessed the situation. The vessel's arrival changed everything. Her carefully laid plans suddenly seemed insufficient against this new threat. Movement in the tunnel near the fuel depot, Chen Wei's voice crackled through her earpiece. One of ours, it's Zhang from the council. Sarah's heart sank. Zhang, the village council's youngest member, had always resented the community's dependence on outsiders like her. What's he doing? The answer came moments later, as Zhang emerged onto the dock, hands raised. Kane, I know where she hides her weapons. I can show you the tunnel network. Sarah watched through her scope as Kane's smile spread across his face. Now that's the spirit of cooperation I've been looking for. He gestured to his men. Show Mr. Zhang our appreciation. Sarah, Jackson's urgent whisper came through the radio. If he reveals the tunnel network, she didn't need him to finish. The tunnels were currently protecting every civilian in Port Haven. If Kane's men found the entrances, the body count would be catastrophic. Zhang was already pointing toward the cannery, describing the hidden entrance Sarah had used earlier. 2 pirates moved to investigate, their weapons ready. Mrs. Lee, Sarah keyed her radio. Get everyone to the deeper tunnels. Use the collapse points if you have to. But those tunnels haven't been maintained in decades, the former nurse protested. They could be unstable. Better unstable tunnels than Kane's men. Sarah lined up her shot carefully. She could take out Zhang, a clean shot to incapacitate him before he revealed more. But that would mean exposing her position. And with that, gunship in the harbor. The choice was taken from her as an explosion rocked the northern pier. The Vietnamese veterans had triggered their charges early, creating chaos near the tunnel entrance Zhang had been about to reveal. Kane's men scattered for cover, but their leader stood calmly in the open, scanning the rooftops. Getting sloppy. Sarah, that diversion was too obvious. He raised a hand and the gunship's mounted weapons swiveled toward the northern buildings. Let's take away some of your hiding spots. The first burst of heavy gunfire tore through the abandoned warehouses, shredding wood and metal like paper. Sarah rolled away from her position seconds before it was turned to splinters. Found you, Kane's voice held satisfaction. You always did favor the high ground. Some habits never change. Through the chaos, Sarah caught glimpses of Zhang being led toward the gunship, still talking, still revealing Port Haven's secrets. The betrayal stung worse than the shrapnel grazing her arm. Chen Wei, she whispered into her radio as she moved through the smoke. Tell me you got everyone deep enough. Static answered her. The radio was dead. Sarah forced herself to focus past the growing knot of fear in her stomach. The gunship changed the game, but it also meant Kane was done playing. He was ready to level Port Haven to get to her. She had one card left to play, one last-ditch protocol she'd prepared, but hoped never to use. It would mean sacrificing most of the harbor, but if it worked... Your time's up, Agent Chen. Kane's voice boomed across the water. I'm done with games. You have 1 minute before I start destroying buildings. Let's see how long you can live with the deaths of these innocent villagers on your conscience. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition, feeling the weight of her choices bearing down. She'd come to Port Haven to escape her past, but her past had found her anyway. Now the only way to save her new home was to embrace fully the person she'd tried to leave behind. Agent Chen took a deep breath, settling into the cold focus of combat. It was time for her last stand. The gunship's heavy artillery tore through Port Haven's waterfront, methodically destroying Sarah's pre-planned positions one by one. From her new hiding spot in the half-collapsed fish market, she watched helplessly as Zhang continued pointing out potential hiding spots, each one marked for destruction by Kane's overwhelming firepower. I have to admit, Sarah, Kane's voice echoed through a megaphone, training the locals was a nice touch. Very insurgency of you. But Mr. Zhang here has been quite helpful in explaining all your little defensive preparations. Sarah's mind flashed to the weapons caches she'd hidden throughout the village, each one now compromised. The careful plans she'd made, the fallback positions, the escape routes, all known to the enemy. She'd trained for this, planned for almost every contingency, but she'd never expected betrayal from within. Her radio crackled with static before coming back to life. Sarah. It was Mrs. Lee, her voice barely audible. We've got wounded. The tunnel collapse. Some people were trapped when the shelling started. Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of command settling heavy on her shoulders. How many? 3 serious, including Chen Wei. The news hit her like a physical blow. Chen Wei, the first person in Port Haven to truly accept her, to suspect her, past and embrace her anyway. Now he was hurt because of her presence here, because of secrets she'd brought with her. Location? She whispered into the radio. The old section, beneath the cannery. But Sarah, Zhang knows about that area too. I heard him talking about the support beams, the weak points. As if on cue, Kane's voice boomed across the harbor again. Speaking of infrastructure, Mr. Zhang has been explaining the fascinating tunnel network under our feet. Apparently, The whole system could collapse with a few strategically placed charges. Sarah's blood ran cold as she pieced it together. Zhang hadn't just betrayed her position, he'd given Kane the means to bury every civilian in Port Haven. Alive! Through the smoke, she caught a glimpse of the gunship's crew preparing demolition charges. They were going to collapse the tunnels, turning the village's last refuge into a mass grave. "You know what I want, Sarah," Kane called out. "Your life for theirs. Simple exchange. Or I start bringing this whole village down around their ears." She keyed her radio one last time. "Jackson, status of the boat charges? Armed and ready," came the reply. "But Sarah, from this angle, detonating them might do more damage to the village than the gunship." She knew he was right. Her contingency plan had been to rig the abandoned boats with fuel and explosives, creating a wall of fire to cover an escape. But with the gunship's new position, the explosion would be pushed back toward the village, instead of out to sea. "Sarah?" Mrs. Lee's voice was urgent. "We can hear them up there. They're placing the charges around the tunnel entrances." The timer was running out. If Sarah surrendered, Kane would kill her, but he might spare the village out of professional courtesy. If she fought on, she might take him down, but at the cost of every life in those tunnels. Her hand drifted to the scar on her shoulder, the wound from Singapore that had started all this. Kane had been her target then, a corrupt operative, selling military secrets. She'd caught his entire network, but he'd escaped in the chaos, leaving her shot and questioning everything. Now, here they were again. But this time, it wasn't just her life on the line. Every person in Port Haven, every friend she'd made, every peaceful morning she'd treasured, all of it hung in the balance. Through the scope of her rifle, she watched Kane directing his men with cold efficiency. He'd chosen this village specifically, turned her own preparations against her, and backed her into an impossible choice. The radio crackled one final time. Chen Wei's voice, weak but determined. "Whatever you're thinking, Sarah, remember, you're one of us now. Trust that. One of us." The words echoed in her mind as a desperate plan began to form. She'd been thinking like Agent Chen, like a lone operator. But Port Haven had taught her something else, something Kane would never understand. She wasn't alone anymore. Sarah's fingers flew across her radio's keypad, switching to the backup frequency she'd established with Jackson. "Remember those fishing nets we prepared? Time to use them. But not how we planned. The ones treated with fuel?" Jackson's voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah, in this wind with the gunship's position." "Exactly." She allowed herself a grim smile. "Get the Vietnamese veterans to help. You'll need their expertise with currents." While Kane's men focused on placing demolition charges around the tunnel entrances, Sarah began putting her desperate plan into motion. She wasn't just a SWAT operator anymore. She was a fisherwoman, and Port Haven had taught her things Kane could never anticipate. "Mrs. Lee," she switched channels. "Those medical supplies we stockpiled, how much alcohol is there?" "Enough to treat 20 serious casualties." "Why?" "I need it all, and every fishing net you can find." Sarah's mind raced through the calculations. Get Mai to help. She knows where every scrap of netting is stored. Above, the gunship's searchlights swept the devastated waterfront. Sarah could hear Kane growing impatient. 5 minutes, Sarah, then I start collapsing tunnels. Maybe we'll make it quick, or maybe we'll do it section by section. Your choice." Zhang's voice carried across the water, eager to prove his continued worth. "The main support beam under the cannery. That's the key point. Take that out, and the whole northern section goes." Sarah's jaw clenched. The northern section, where Chen Wei and the other wounded lay trapped. Time was running out. Through her scope she watched the tide shifting, the harbour currents changing as they always did at this hour. 5 years of fishing, these waters was about to pay off. "Jackson, status?" Nets in position. Veterans say the current's almost right. Sarah took a deep breath. Mrs. Lee. Alcohols distributed through the intact nets. Mai found us at least 30 more from storage. Good. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition. Listen carefully. When I give the signal, I need every able-bodied person to start making noise. Doesn't matter what kind. Tools, voices, anything. Make them think you're trying to dig out. But that will tell them exactly where we are. Trust me. Sarah's voice softened. Chen Wei was right. I'm not alone anymore. She switched to her backup pistol, leaving the rifle behind. What she was about to do required mobility over accuracy. All units ready, she whispered. On my mark. Sarah took one final look at the harbour she'd called home for 5 years, the burning boats, the shattered docks, the water itself. It was all part of her plan now. 3, 2, 1, mark! The tunnels erupted with noise, shouts, banging, the sounds of desperate people trying to escape. Kane's men turned toward the commotion, exactly as planned. Found them! Zhang shouted triumphantly. Under the cannery, just like I said. The gunship's searchlight swung toward the noise. And that's when Sarah struck. Jackson and the veterans released the treated nets into the harbour, the alcohol-soaked mesh carried by the changing tide directly toward the gunship. At the same time, Sarah fired her first shot, not at Kane's men, but at the burning boats nearby. The harbour exploded into flames as the burning fuel raced across the water's surface, following the paths created by the submerged nets. The gunships. Crew realized too late what was happening as the fire surrounded their vessel. "Get us out of here!" Kane's shout was nearly lost in the chaos. But the veterans had done their job perfectly. The nets, now rising with the tide, entangled the gunship's propellers. As the flames reached the vessel, the crew had no choice but to abandon ship. Sarah was already moving, using the chaos to pick off the men guarding the demolition charges. One by one, they fell to precise shots, their bodies hitting the water. As the harbour burned around them, "Zhang!" Kane's voice held real fear now. "Where are her firing positions? Where is she?" But Zhang stood frozen, watching his betrayal literally go up in flames. He'd never understood what Sarah had learned in Port Haven. The sea itself could be a weapon if you knew its moods and tides. The gunship, its hull now blazing, began to list heavily to port. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Kane had brought military might to a fishing village, and the village had fought back. The burning gunship cast hellish shadows across Port Haven's harbour as Kane emerged from cover, his tactical vest gleaming with water from the firefight. His expression had changed. Gone was the confident commander, replaced by something darker, more personal. "You've learned some new tricks, Sarah," he called out, firing a burst toward her last known position. "Fishing nets and tides, not exactly SWAT protocol." Sarah moved silently through the smoke, using the chaos of the burning harbour to mask her movements. But Kane's words nagged at her memory. Something about Singapore, about why he'd chosen her specifically to hunt down. "You know what I never understood?" Kane's voice carried over the crackling flames. "Why the Bureau's best maritime tactical specialist suddenly quit after Singapore. Was it the bullet I put in you? Or was it because you finally realized what you'd done?" A cold tendril of doubt crept into Sarah's mind. "What are you talking about?" "Those terrorists I was supposedly selling secrets to. They were deep cover agents working to expose corruption in your precious FBI." Kane's laugh was bitter. "You didn't catch a criminal network that day, Sarah. You destroyed a 3-year undercover operation." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Sarah remembered the aftermath of Singapore, the closed hearings, the classified reports, the way her superiors had rushed to push her into retirement. "You're lying!" she hissed, but uncertainty colored her voice. "Am I? Why do you think no one came looking for you these past 5 years? They were happy to let you disappear. Easier than admitting they'd used their best operator to protect the very corruption she thought she was fighting. Through her scope, Sarah watched Kane's remaining men taking up positions around the harbor. The fire was spreading, cutting off escape routes. In the tunnels below, she could hear the muffled sounds of villagers moving deeper into the network. "It doesn't matter," Sarah said finally. "Whatever happened in Singapore, these people are innocent." "Innocent?" Kane's voice turned mocking. "Like those agents in Singapore were innocent? Face it, Sarah, everywhere you go, people die because of your blind loyalty. How many bodies will you stack up before you finally question who you're really fighting for?" A burst of gunfire forced Sarah to roll behind a stack of fuel drums. Kane was moving methodically closer, using her own tactics against her. She could hear his men coordinating their approach through encrypted radios. "Chen Wei," she whispered. Into her own radio. "Are you there?" Static answered her. The harbour master's condition was unknown, like so much else now. Kane's words had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. If he was telling the truth about Singapore... "Sarah," Mrs. Lee's voice suddenly crackled through. "They're flooding the lower tunnels. Water's rising fast." The tactical implications hit her immediately. Kane wasn't trying to collapse the tunnels. He was trying to flush everyone out, force them to surface where his men could contain them. "Remember your training, Sarah?" Kane called out. "When the target has nowhere to run, they always make mistakes. How many more lives are you willing to sacrifice for a lie?" Sarah's finger tightened on her trigger. She had a clear shot. Could end this right now. But Kane's words echoed in her head. Singapore, the classified reports, the rushed retirement, the water below was rising, her friends were in danger, and Sarah realized she had to make a choice. Dwell on the past or protect her present. Through the smoke, she caught a glimpse of Zhang slipping away from Kane's men, moving toward the tunnel entrance where Chen Wei lay wounded. Whatever the truth about Singapore, the immediate threat was clear. Sarah Chen, agent, fisherwoman, protector, made her decision. The past could wait. Port Haven needed her now. She emerged from cover, rifle raised, as the harbor burned around. "You want to talk about Singapore, Kane? Let's talk, face to face." Kane's smile was visible even through the smoke. "Finally, just you and me, Sarah, like it should have been 5 years ago." The endgame was beginning, and this time, there would be no unanswered questions left behind. Sarah circled through the burning harbor, keeping low as Kane's voice echoed off the charred buildings. The rising water in the tunnels complicated everything. She had minutes, not hours, to end this. "You know what they called you in the agency?" Kane's footsteps splashed through puddles of seawater and fuel. "The Ghost, because you never missed, never failed, never questioned, the perfect operator, until Singapore." "You were selling tactical data to known extremists," Sarah countered, moving between shadows. "I saw the evidence myself." Kane's laugh was harsh. "You saw what they wanted you to see. Did you ever wonder why Deputy Director Morrison pushed so hard for you to lead that raid? Why the intel came through unofficial channels? The name hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. Morrison, her mentor, the man who'd recruited her into SWAT, the one who'd recommended her immediate retirement after Singapore. Morrison was the leak," Kane continued closer now. "He was selling agency secrets, using his anti-corruption task force as cover. My team was building a case against him, until you showed up." Through the smoke, Sarah caught a glimpse of Zhang helping villagers out of a flooding tunnel entrance. The betrayer was trying to redeem himself, but Kane's men were moving to intercept. "Why?" Tell me this now," Sarah asked, buying time as she lined up her shot. "Because you deserve to know why you have to die." Kane's voice hardened. "Morrison's still out there, still selling secrets, but as long as you're alive, there's a loose end, someone who might eventually piece it together." Sarah's radio crackled. "Sarah?" Chen Wei's voice was weak. "The water? People are trapped." The choice crystallized in her mind. The past, Morrison's betrayal, Singapore, her own unwitting role in it all, none of it mattered against the immediate reality of Port Haven's people in danger. "You're right about one thing, Kane," she called out, rising from cover. "I never questioned orders, never looked deeper. That was my failure." Kane emerged from the smoke 20 yards away, rifle raised. "Finally, some honesty." "But you're wrong about why I left." Sarah's voice carried across the burning harbor. "I didn't quit because of doubt or guilt. I quit because I was tired of being nothing but a weapon. Port Haven gave me something else, something worth protecting." "How noble!" Kane's finger tightened on his trigger. "And how many of your new friends die while you play hero?" Sarah's response was a single shot, not at Kane, but at the support beam above him. As he dove for cover, she was already moving, racing toward the tunnel entrance where Zhang was struggling to help people out of the rising water. "Get them to high ground," she shouted, laying down covering fire as Kane's men scattered. "Sarah!" Kane's voice was furious now. "This ends here." "You're right," she muttered, reaching the tunnel entrance. Inside, she could see villagers wading through chest-deep water, helping the elderly and children. Among them was Chen Wei, being supported by Mrs. Li. "You were a ghost, Sarah," Kane called out. "A perfect weapon. I'm going to make you one again." Sarah turned to Zhang, who stood trembling beside her. "Get them to the cannery, high ground, now." "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know." "Prove it by saving them." As Zhang began coordinating the evacuation, Sarah checked her ammunition. 1. Magazine left. Beyond the tunnel entrance, Kane was moving closer, his men forming a perimeter. The truth about Singapore changed everything and nothing. She'd been used, manipulated into destroying a legitimate investigation. But that knowledge didn't alter the reality in front of her. A village in danger, people who trusted her, a home worth fighting for. Sarah Chen had been a ghost once, but ghosts didn't have friends, didn't have community, didn't have purpose beyond the mission. As she heard Kane approaching, Sarah made peace with her past. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the shield between her people and harm, and it was time to remind Kane why she'd been the best. The evacuation of the flooding tunnels had created exactly what Sarah needed: chaos, confusion, and most importantly, witnesses. Kane's carefully orchestrated operation was unraveling as dozens of villagers emerged into the burning harbor, their presence making it impossible for his men to fire freely. "Jackson," she whispered into her radio, "remember our contingency for a typhoon? The fishing fleet's emergency protocols?" He paused. "Sarah, you're not thinking." "Get to the harbor master's office. Signal flares, every color. Light up the sky." She could practically hear him piecing it together. Port Haven wasn't as isolated as it seemed, not when every fishing village on the coast monitored emergency signals. Standard protocol. Multiple. Flares meant imminent disaster. Every available boat would come running. "Kane," she called out, standing deliberately in the open. "You wanted to finish Singapore. Let's finish it, just you and me." Through the smoke, she saw him gesture to his men to hold position. His obsession with her had become personal. He wouldn't let anyone else take the shot. "No more tricks, Sarah." He emerged from cover, rifle lowered but ready. "No more hiding behind civilians." "You've got it backwards," she said, letting her own rifle hang loose. "I'm not hiding behind them. I'm standing with them." Something you never understood about Singapore, about any of it. Kane's laugh was bitter. "Still self-righteous to the end. You destroyed years of work, got good agents killed, all because you never looked past your orders." "You're right." Sarah's admission caught him off guard. "I was a weapon, pointed at a target and fired. That's what Singapore taught me, why I had to leave." "And now?" Kane's eyes narrowed as the first emergency flare burst red against the night sky behind her. "Now I choose my own targets, make my own decisions." Another. Flare, this one green. Starting with the choice to trust people instead of just using them. The deeper meaning of the flares suddenly hit Kane. His head snapped up, scanning the horizon. Calling for help? Out here? There's nothing but fishing villages for miles. Sarah smiled. Exactly. The first distant engine sounds were already carrying. Across the water, fishing boats responding to the emergency signal, dozens of them loaded with hardy men and women who looked after their own. You think a bunch of fishermen can save you? Kane raised his rifle. I've got trained killers. No, Sarah said quietly. You've got mercenaries, men who fight for money. I've got neighbors, people who fight for each other. The first boats were visible now, their lights cutting through the fog. Kane's men were turning, unsure where to point their weapons as vessels appeared from multiple directions. Last chance, Kane. Surrender. Face justice for Morrison's corruption. Help me finish what your team started in Singapore. For a moment, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Then his face hardened. You had your chance to learn the truth. Now you'll die with it. His rifle came up fast, but Sarah was already moving. 5 years of peace hadn't dulled her instincts. They'd sharpened them with new purpose. As Kane's shot sparked off the metal behind her, Sarah caught a glimpse of Jackson in the harbour master's tower, sending up the final flare pattern. The signal that would bring not just nearby fishing boats, but the Coast Guard station she'd quietly alerted the day she first arrived in Port Haven. Kane had come looking for a ghost. Instead, he'd found something far more dangerous. A protector, with something worth dying for, and an entire coast full of people ready to stand with her. The approaching fishing boats cast long shadows through the harbour smoke, their spotlights sweeping across the chaos of Port Haven's waterfront. But Sarah knew Kane wouldn't go down easily. Men like him always had one last card to play. Think about it, Sarah, he called through the darkness, his voice tight with controlled rage. Those boats get any closer, and everyone learns about Singapore, about Morrison, about what the Bureau really is. You ready for that? Ready for your new friends to know exactly what you were? Sarah moved through the wreckage of the fish market, keeping the wounded Chen Wei in her peripheral vision as Mrs. Li helped him toward safety. 5 years of peaceful mornings, of mended nets and quiet conversations flashed through her mind. You know what they'll find out, Kane? She pitched her voice to Carrie. That I was wrong, that I followed orders, without questioning, that I'm not perfect. A pause as she shifted position, and that I learned from it. Kane's bitter laugh echoed off the burning buildings. Learned? You ran away. Hid in this backwater, playing fisherman while Morrison continued destroying lives. Through her scope, Sarah caught glimpses of Kane's remaining men, looking nervously at the approaching boats. Their loyalty was wavering. Mercenaries weren't paid enough to face down an entire coast's worth of angry fishermen. Maybe you're right, Sarah admitted, drawing closer to Kane's position. Maybe I should have stayed. Fought back. Exposed Morrison. She could see him now, his profile outlined against the flames. But I found something better here. Something you never understood. Enlighten me. His sarcasm couldn't quite mask his tension as the first fishing boats entered the harbour. Community. Trust. The very things Morrison corrupted. Sarah's voice hardened. The things you helped him destroy. Kane's response was a burst of gunfire that forced Sarah behind a stack of crates. Pretty words from a woman who executed my entire team. They shot first, Sarah countered, remembering Singapore with sudden clarity, because they knew I'd discover the truth eventually. That's why Morrison sent me. He knew I'd follow orders without question, the perfect weapon to eliminate the threat to his operation. The fishing boats were close enough now that Sarah could make out familiar faces, captains she'd shared drinks with, crews she'd helped during storms. They were armed with whatever they could find, fishing spears, flare guns, old rifles. "Sarah," Jackson's voice crackled through her radio. "Coast Guard's 10 minutes out." She watched Kane checking his own radio, knew he was getting the same information from his spotters. His operation was falling apart, which made him more dangerous than ever. "Last chance, Kane," Sarah called out. "Surrender, help me take down Morrison, make it right." For a moment there was silence but for the approaching boats and the crackle of flames. Then Kane's voice, cold and final. "You want to make it right, Sarah? Here's your chance. I've got a dead man's switch. Either you face me alone, right now, or I trigger what's left of the demolition charges. How many people are still in those tunnels? How much blood on your hands this time?" Sarah's jaw clenched as she checked her ammunition. 1 magazine, 3 rounds. It would have to be enough. "You wanted the ghost." She stood, rifle lowered. "Come and get her." Because Kane had made one crucial mistake. He thought she was still running from Singapore, from her past, from the truth about Morrison. But Sarah Chen wasn't running anymore. She was standing her ground. And this time, she was fighting for something worth more than orders or duty. She was fighting for home. Sarah moved out into the open, each step deliberate, as she advanced toward the center of the burning harbor. Around them, the first fishing boats were docking, their crews armed but holding position. They could sense the tension, knew better than to interfere with what was coming. "That's it," Kane called out, emerging from his own cover. "Just like Singapore, face to face." But this wasn't Singapore. Sarah wasn't moving with the rigid precision of a SWAT operator anymore. Her steps had the easy grace of someone who'd spent years reading the movement of waves, anticipating the roll of a deck beneath her feet. The charred dock creaked under her boots, telling her everything she needed to know about its structural integrity. "Your men are surrounded," she said calmly, noting how Kane's remaining forces had backed away, creating a circle around them. "Coast Guard's coming. It's over." Kane's smile was razor-sharp. "It's only over when I say it is." He held up a small detonator. "Dead man's switch, remember? I drop this, the charges go off. How many people down there, Sarah, in your precious tunnels?" Through her earpiece, she could hear Mrs. Lee whispering, "Almost everyone's out, but Chen Wei, he's stuck. The water's rising." Sarah's mind raced. Chen Wei had saved her life more than once today, with his trust, his knowledge, his quiet strength. She wasn't about to let him die now. "You want to finish Singapore?" she asked, taking another step forward. "Let's finish it, you and me, but first tell me why, the real reason." "You know why." Kane's finger tightened on his rifle trigger. "Morrison's corruption needed to be exposed." "No," Sarah shook her head. "That's the mission. I want to know why you're here, in this village right now. Why you hunted me for 5 years." Something flickered in Kane's eyes. An old pain, quickly masked. "Because you didn't just kill my team in Singapore. You killed my brother." The admission hung in the air between them. Sarah remembered the final moments of that raid, the chaos, the gunfire, the split-second decisions. She'd never known the names of the men she'd shot. "He was undercover," Kane continued, voice raw. "Deep cover, building the case against Morrison. And you just came in shooting. The perfect weapon, right?" "No questions asked." Sarah took another step. The dock swayed slightly under her feet, weakened by fire, by combat, by the day's violence. 5 years of fishing had taught her exactly how such structures behaved under stress. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said quietly. "But this isn't justice, this is revenge." "Same thing." Kane raised his rifle. "No." Sarah's voice carried across the water. "Justice is exposing Morrison, finishing what your brother started. Revenge is burning down a village of innocent people." She could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between the operator he'd been and the obsessed man he'd become. His finger tightened on the detonator. "Last chance, Kane. Help me take down Morrison. Honor your brother's real mission." For a moment she thought she'd reached him. Then his face hardened. "Too late for that." 5 years too late. He raised his rifle and Sarah saw her opening. Not in his stance or his aim, but in something else, something only a fisherwoman would notice. The tide was turning, and with it, the burned dock's support beams were shifting. As Kane's fingers squeezed the trigger, Sarah was already moving, not diving for cover, but striking the dock itself with all her weight. The weakened wood groaned, shifted, and finally gave way. Kane's shot went wide as the structure collapsed beneath them both, sending them plunging toward the dark water below. The last thing Sarah saw before the impact was the dead man's switch flying from Kane's grip toward Jackson's, waiting hands on the intact part of the pier. The endgame was beginning, and Sarah had home field advantage. The cold harbor water hit like a hammer, but Sarah was ready for it. 5 years of diving to check nets had taught her every current, every depth, every hidden danger of Port Haven's waters. Kane, for all his tactical training, was in her world. Now, they crashed through the surface together, rifles lost in the impact. In the murky darkness, Sarah could make out Kane's shape thrashing against the current, trying to orient himself, but she was already moving, letting the tide carry her. Into position. Above, flashlight beams from the fishing boats cut through the water, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Sarah used them to her advantage, staying in the darker areas as she circled her opponent. Kane spotted her and lunged, combat knife glinting in the filtered light. But his movements were those of a land fighter trying to work underwater. Sarah rolled with the current, letting his momentum carry him past her. Her own grandfather's knife slashed out, catching his arm. They broke the surface briefly, gasping for air. "You can't win this," Sarah called out. "Not here, not in these waters." Kane's response was a snarl as he dove at her again, forcing them both under. This time his knife found its mark, opening a cut along her ribs. But the cold water numbed the pain, and Sarah had fought through worse. Through her burning lungs, Sarah heard a familiar sound, the deep pulse of the Coast Guard cutter's engines approaching the harbor. Kane heard it too. His attacks became more desperate, less controlled. They surfaced again, Kane's grip like iron around her throat. "You think this changes anything?" he gasped. "Morrison's still out there, still corrupting everything he touches." Sarah drove her elbow back, breaking his hold. "You're right," she managed between breaths, "so help me stop him the right way." For a moment she saw hesitation in his eyes. Then a spotlight from above caught them both, and Kane's face twisted with renewed rage. He struck out with his knife. But Sarah was already moving. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The tide was at its strongest now, creating a peculiar swirl near the destroyed dock, a pattern she'd observed countless times while fishing. As Kane lunged, Sarah let herself be pulled under, drawing him into the current's grip. Underwater, the battle became a deadly dance. Kane's superior strength meant nothing against the harbor's force. Sarah moved with the flow, conserving energy, while Kane fought against it, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as his lungs burned. She caught glimpses of his face in the filtered light, saw the moment he realized his mistake, saw the recognition that he'd been drawn into a trap not by the FBI's best tactical operator, but by a simple fisherwoman who knew these waters like she knew her own heartbeat. His knife hand shot out one last time, desperation lending it speed. But Sarah had already shifted, letting the current carry her inside his guard. Her grandfather's knife found its mark, not a killing blow, but a precise strike to disable. Kane's weapon fell away into the darkness, his good arm wrapped around her in a last attempt to drag her down with him. But Sarah had been waiting for this too. She kicked hard, using his own grip as leverage to propel them both toward the surface. They broke through together, gasping and struggling as rescue boats converged from all directions. "It's over, Kane," Sarah managed between breaths. "But it doesn't have to end here." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something other than hatred there, understanding perhaps, or recognition. "Your brother," she said softly, maintaining her hold as the boats drew closer. "Help me finish his work. Take down Morrison. Make it mean something." The fight seemed to drain out of him then. Around them, Port Haven's fishing fleet and the Coast Guard created a ring of light and justice long delayed. Kane looked at the village he'd tried to destroy, at the community that had fought back, at the woman who'd found strength not in her tactical training, but in the simple wisdom of the sea. "You've changed," he said finally, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Sarah nodded as the rescue lines dropped toward them. "We all have to change, Kane, or the past owns us forever." 2 weeks after the battle, Sarah stood on Port Haven's newly repaired main dock, watching the sunrise paint the sky in familiar shades of gold. Her ribs still ached from Kane's knife, but like the village itself, she was healing. Chenwei joined her, moving slowly with his cane but alive, thanks to Jackson's quick thinking with the dead man's switch. "The last of the fishing boats are being repaired today," he said in Mandarin, "and Kane's information about Morrison has been passed to the proper authorities." Sarah nodded, her hands automatically checking the nets she was preparing. Some habits never changed, whether you were a SWAT operator or a fisherwoman. "And Zhang?" "Community service. Rebuilding what was damaged." Chen Wei's eyes crinkled with something like amusement. "Under Mrs. Lee's supervision." The harbor was coming back to life around them. Fishermen called out greetings as they prepared. Their boats, children ran along the waterfront, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from Mrs. Lee's rebuilt bakery. Port Haven had been tested by fire and water and emerged stronger. "You're staying then?" Chen Wei asked quietly. Sarah looked out at the waters she'd come to know so well, where she'd finally found peace, not by running from her past, but by building something new. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm home." The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of fog as Port Haven's fishermen set out for another day at sea. Sarah Chen, no longer a ghost but a guardian, cast her nets into the familiar waters and smiled. Some battles were fought with bullets and tactics, but the most important ones, she'd learned, were won with trust, community, and the courage to change.